no one is wrong. Everyone is doing what seems most reasonable, and that is when everything starts to go wrong. Iran and related forces continue to escalate tensions. Global energy routes are at risk of disruption. And from what I can see, leaders, including Donald Trump, are still making statements that suggest they clearly understand what is happening. And what confuses me is not that the situation is getting worse, but that every side can explain their actions in a completely reasonable way. And when you hear it, it sounds quite convincing. One side says they are defending themselves against a threat. That makes sense, because no one wants to be attacked without responding. The other side says they are simply responding to protect their own interests. That also makes sense, because no country wants to be in a weak position. In an unstable region, allies say they need to intervene to maintain regional stability. That also sounds reasonable, because if no one intervenes, things could become worse. And even when there are decisions that escalate the situation, they are often explained as there being no other choice. And somehow, that statement almost always sounds reasonable. At the moment, it is said. So if you look at each individual action, each individual statement, each individual decision, there is almost nothing that seems truly unreasonable. And if you only look at things in that way, everything appears to be fine. It is just that when you put everything together, it is not fine. Because if every side is acting correctly, according to its own logic, then things should become more stable, not increasingly tense. And that is when I begin to see that the problem is not a lack of logic, but an excess of logic coexisting, each one valid within its own scope. But when combined, they do not form a picture that an ordinary person can understand. And perhaps that is the hardest part of politics. It is not chaotic, because it is irrational, but it becomes difficult to understand, precisely because it is too rational in too many different ways. And if all of this were just a few individuals behaving somewhat excessively, then things would probably be much simpler, because I could simply sit back, fold my arms, and calmly watch this slightly absurd story unfold the same way you watch a movie when you know that it will eventually reach an ending. But the problem is that it is not just a few individuals. It is systems large enough that every small action creates consequences that no one within those systems has to directly bear immediately. When an attack happens, it does not stop at the two parties involved. It leads to rising energy prices, disrupted supply chains, increasing transportation costs, and eventually very concrete things like electricity prices, fuel prices, and food prices, all starting to creep up, little by little, in places far away from the conflict. And the only thing that does not increase is wages. And what is interesting is that the people who end up paying more for their lives are usually not the ones who made any decisions in that chain of actions. When tensions escalate, budgets begin to shift toward new priorities. And that sounds reasonable, because in an unstable world, security is always placed first. But that also means that things once considered foundational, such as education, healthcare, and social welfare, start to become things that can wait, not because they are less important, but because they are not as urgent. And in a very logical way, money will always flow toward what needs to be dealt with immediately, while the things that determine what a society will become in 10 or 20 years can be postponed. And what is worth noticing is that later usually never truly arrives. But that also means that somewhere there are hospitals lacking resources. There are education systems being cut back. And there are people living in a slightly worse version of life. Each year, as the situation drags on, trust begins to erode. Not because of a single specific event, but because of the feeling that everything is changing. Yet no one can clearly explain where it will end. And that makes people more sensitive, more divided, and more likely to believe any story that sounds clearer than the rest. And then you start to see familiar patterns appear. Prices rise, but no one takes direct responsibility. Policies change, but there is always a reasonable explanation attached. Tensions escalate, but they are always described as necessary under the circumstances. And if you look at that entire process, you will notice something slightly unsettling. There is not a single decision that, on its own, seems large enough to cause all of this. But when all of those reasonable decisions stack on top of each other, they create a reality that billions of people have to live in, a reality where none of the people who created it truly step forward and say, this is the outcome we wanted. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part. It is not what is happening. It is how it is happening. Very slowly, very logically, and small enough at each step that no one feels the need to stop. And if you look more closely at how these decisions are made, you will notice something quite interesting. In politics, people do not need to be completely right. They only need to be reasonable enough to continue. When Israel carries out an attack and calls it a preventive action to protect security, it sounds very reasonable, because in a region where risks are always present, striking first is sometimes seen as the safest option. When Iran or related forces respond and call it a necessary reaction, that is also reasonable, because no one wants to be attacked and remain passive. And when the United States, whether under Donald Trump or any other administration, steps in with the justification of protecting strategic interests or maintaining regional stability, that still sounds reasonable, because in a connected world like today, no conflict is truly far away. At first glance, everything feels logical. And what is interesting is that everyone is quite certain that they are right. And that is usually when you should start to worry. There is just one small detail. No one clearly says how this will end. No one says where the stopping point is. No one says what happens if everything is reasonable, but the outcome is not very good. Instead, everything continues like a chain reaction, where each step can be explained very smoothly, as long as you only look at the step right before it. And so you end up with a system that is very stable in terms of explanations, but quite unstable in terms of results, because when every action is justified, responsibility is also divided into smaller pieces along with each action. And when responsibility has been divided for long enough, no one is responsible for the whole story anymore. If that still feels a bit abstract, let me simplify it. Imagine a cage. Inside it, there is a chicken, a duck, and a cat. And somehow they decide to live together. Everything is fine until it is not. One day, the chicken suddenly starts running around in panic, the kind of running where it is not even sure what it is running from, but it runs first just to be safe. The cat sees that and immediately chases after it. No one asks it to, but standing still in that situation feels a bit unprofessional. The duck does the most reasonable thing it can think of. It stands still and starts shouting very loudly, like, I do not know what is happening, but something is definitely happening. And within just a few seconds, the cage collapses. And if this story feels a bit familiar, then maybe it is not just a story. Everything goes silent. A silence that feels very thought-provoking, because there is nothing left to make it worse. After that, each one starts explaining. The chicken says it ran because it was being chased. That sounds reasonable. The cat says it chased because the chicken was running. That also sounds reasonable. The duck says it shouted because the other two were causing chaos. That sounds reasonable as well. None of them are wrong. Only the cage is gone. But none of them talk about that. They do not fix it. They do not ask. They do not care why it collapsed. They only need to be sure that in that moment, they did the right thing. And if you rebuild the cage, let everything start over, then most likely everything will repeat in exactly the same way. Not because they are stupid, but because every time there is always a story. That is reasonable enough to keep doing the same thing again. And perhaps that is the real point. It is not that everything is happening irrationally. It is that everything is happening in a very reasonable way, to the point that there is no reason strong enough to stop. Everything does not stop at war or politics. It goes straight into the lives of people who are not involved in any decisions, and the way it appears is not loud. There is no clear moment to recognize it. It is just that prices begin to rise. Jobs become more unstable. Plans that were once considered certain start to be delayed. And at some point, you realize that everything has changed. But it is very difficult to say exactly when it began. When conflict escalates, its impact does not stay within that region, but spreads through energy, transportation, and supply chains, and eventually reaches daily living costs. You do not need to understand the entire system to notice this. Simply living in it is enough. Businesses become more cautious. Spending is tightened. Things that were once stable now feel temporary. No one calls it a crisis, but no one truly feels at ease either. Everything continues as normal, in a way where everyone senses that something is not right, yet continues as if nothing is wrong. And this state lasts long enough to create a very distinct kind of mindset. People continue their daily lives, but there is always an underlying feeling that things could get worse at any moment. In that state, the way people consume information begins to change. News is no longer simply something to understand what is happening, but becomes something to monitor whether the situation is getting worse. And when people have to live in uncertainty for too long, they begin to need clearer answers. Not because reality has become simpler, but because they cannot maintain a sense of ambiguity while still keeping psychological stability. From there, the way people understand the world begins to split. The same event. But if you change the narrator, you get a completely different story. Some see it as necessary within a complex context. Others see it as a sign that everything is going in the wrong direction. And from each perspective, both interpretations are reasonable. The problem is that they no longer meet at the same point. Once you believe in one explanation, the information you receive afterward almost automatically aligns with it. You pay attention to what reinforces your belief and pass over what makes you question it. It does not require intention. It happens very naturally and gradually. Two people can look at the same piece of news, but are actually talking about two completely different stories. At some point, the problem is no longer a disagreement of opinions, but the absence of a shared reality to verify what is actually happening. And when each person has a version that is reasonable enough to believe, then discussion is no longer about understanding, but only about defending their own interpretation. And when there is no shared reality, then any story can become reasonable as long as it fits the belief of the listener. And honestly, if you look at all of that, feeling frustrated is not hard to understand, because clearly what is happening out there is not just a story on the news. It is directly affecting how you live, how you spend money, and how safe or unsafe you feel in your own life. It is just that. After a while, you begin to realize something slightly uncomfortable. Understanding the problem more clearly does not mean you can control it, and feeling more frustrated does not make it stop. So at some point, the question is no longer what is happening out there. It becomes how you are going to live while it is still happening. And the answer, it does not sound very grand, but it is the only thing that is truly it is within your control to live a little more consciously, to not immediately believe the thing that sounds the most reasonable, to not immediately react to the thing that makes you the most uncomfortable, and most importantly, to leave a small space to consider that you might not fully understand yet. It sounds simple, but if you look closely, you will see that most problems begin when everyone becomes certain too quickly that they are right. So sometimes the best way to not make things worse is not to try to be more right. It is to be a little less certain, and maybe that will not change the world immediately, but at least it makes the way you live in that world a little easier to breathe. You cannot control where the world is going, but at least you can still choose how you move within it.